I was standing in the abandoned greenhouse behind my grandfather's farmhouse when I found the hidden laboratory that would make me richer than I ever dreamed possible. But when my Uncle David's face turned pale as I revealed what Grandpa Frank had really been cultivating for the past 20 years, I realized the family fortune he'd tried to steal was nothing compared to what was growing in the soil beneath our feet. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning I inherited everything, I was grading second-grade math worksheets in my cramped studio apartment above Chen's grocery store in Cedar Falls, Iowa. The rent was $400 a month, which was exactly what I could afford on my elementary school teacher's salary after paying my student loans, car payment, and credit card minimums that seemed to grow larger every month no matter how little I spent. My phone buzzed with a call from Tom Rodriguez, the estate lawyer who'd been handling Grandpa Frank's affairs since his death 3 weeks earlier. I'd been dreading this conversation, knowing that whatever small inheritance might come my way would probably go straight to paying down the debt that kept me awake at night, staring at my water-stained ceiling and wondering how I'd gotten so far behind in life at 32. Sarah, Tom's voice was unusually formal when I answered. Can you come to my office this afternoon? There are some developments with your grandfather's estate that we need to discuss in person. My heart sank. In my experience, lawyers asking for in-person meetings meant complications, legal fees, and problems I couldn't afford. I'll be there at 4, I said, already calculating whether I had enough gas money to drive the 12 miles to his downtown office. The law office of Rodriguez and Associates occupied the second floor of a restored brick building on Main Street, the kind of place that charged by the hour and made people like me feel underdressed. Tom met me in the small conference room where I'd signed papers after Grandpa Frank's funeral, but this time he had several thick folders spread across the mahogany table and an expression I couldn't quite read. Sarah, he began, settling into his chair with the careful movements of someone delivering news that would change everything. I have to admit, this is the most unusual estate situation I've encountered in 20 years of practice. Your grandfather was apparently quite the strategist. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair, the same wooden seat where I'd learned 3 weeks ago that Grandpa Frank had left me his farm. At the time, I'd been touched but overwhelmed. The 150 acres of corn and soybean fields in Willowbrook County represented a connection to family history, but also a responsibility I wasn't sure I could handle. The property taxes alone were more than I made in 2 months of teaching. Tom opened the first folder and pulled out a document I recognized as Grandpa Frank's will, but there were additional pages I hadn't seen before. Sarah, when we read your grandfather's will initially, we were working with what I thought was the complete document. However, yesterday I received a call from Franklin Mitchell's personal attorney in Des Moines, a man named Charles Brennan, who apparently handled some of your grandfather's more private affairs. More private affairs? I felt my stomach tighten. Grandpa Frank had lived simply, driving his old pickup truck to the Harvest Diner every Tuesday for coffee with the other retired farmers, tending his garden, and reading agricultural journals by the light of his ancient table lamp. What kind of private affairs could a 78-year-old farmer possibly have had? Tom spread several documents across the table. It turns out your grandfather maintained separate legal counsel for certain business ventures that he kept completely confidential, even from family members. According to these documents, Franklin Mitchell was not just a simple farmer. He was also the sole owner of Mitchell Agricultural Research, a limited liability company that has been conducting specialized crop development for the past 15 years. The words washed over me like cold water. Grandpa Frank, who I'd visited every summer as a child, who'd taught me to identify different types of soil by texture and smell, who'd seemed content with his simple life of growing corn and beans, had apparently been running some kind of agricultural business I'd never heard of. Tom continued, his voice taking on the careful tone lawyers use when delivering information that sounds impossible. According to these records, Mitchell Agricultural Research holds several provisional patents on drought-resistant seed varieties, maintains contracts with 3 major university research programs, and has been conducting field trials that have attracted interest from some very significant agricultural corporations. I stared at the papers, trying to process what he was telling me. Patents? Corporations? This sounded like science fiction, not the quiet farming life I'd always associated with Grandpa Frank's property. There's more, Tom said, pulling out another folder. 2 days ago, I received a formal inquiry from Sunrise Agricultural Holdings, a subsidiary of Meridian Corporation. They're offering to purchase the Mitchell property and all associated agricultural research assets for $12.5 million. $12.5 million. The number was so large it felt meaningless, like play money from a board game. I taught second grade in a rural Iowa school district. My biggest financial decision in the past 5 years had been whether I could afford to fix my car's air conditioning. The idea that I might own something worth $12.5 million was so far outside my reality that I couldn't even feel excited about it. I don't understand, I said quietly. Why would anyone pay that much money for a farm? Even good agricultural land in Iowa doesn't sell for anywhere near that price. Tom leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. Sarah, according to these documents, your grandfather wasn't just growing corn and soybeans. For the past 20 years, he's been developing and testing specialty seed varieties that could potentially revolutionize drought-resistant agriculture. The preliminary research suggests he's created genetic variants that could maintain full productivity with 60% less water than traditional crops. The implications hit me slowly. Drought-resistant crops that could maintain productivity with significantly less water weren't just valuable, they were potentially world-changing technology. Climate change was making water scarcity an increasingly critical issue for farmers across the globe. Seeds that could produce full harvests with minimal irrigation could be worth billions of dollars to the right company. But Tom wasn't finished. The inquiry from Sunrise Agricultural Holdings came with a timeline. They want an answer within 30 days, and they've made it clear that this is their only offer. According to their letter, they believe your grandfather's research is at a critical juncture, and any delay in development could cause the technology to lose its competitive advantage. 30 days to decide whether to sell agricultural research I didn't know existed for more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. I felt like Alice falling down the rabbit hole, except instead of Wonderland, I was tumbling into a world of corporate agriculture and genetic patents that I understood about, as well as quantum physics. There's one more thing, Tom said, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper. Your Uncle David called my office this morning. Apparently, he's learned about the Sunrise Agricultural Holdings offer, and he's requesting an immediate meeting to discuss what he calls irregularities in your grandfather's estate planning. Uncle David. I hadn't spoken to my father's brother since Grandpa Frank's funeral, where he'd made polite conversation while clearly calculating the value of everything around him. David Mitchell owned Mitchell Development Corporation, a successful real estate company that specialized in converting rural properties into suburban housing developments. He'd been trying to convince Grandpa Frank to sell the farm for years, arguing that agricultural land so close to Cedar Falls would be perfect for a residential subdivision. What kind of irregularities? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect that Uncle David's sudden interest in estate planning had more to do with $12.5 million than genuine concern for legal procedures. Tom gathered the papers carefully. He's claiming that your grandfather wasn't mentally competent when he updated his will 2 years ago. David is suggesting that Franklin was suffering from early-stage dementia and that his decisions regarding the farm were influenced by what he calls unscrupulous business partners who took advantage of an elderly man's confusion. I felt anger rising in my chest. Grandpa Frank had been sharp as a tack right up until his heart attack. He'd been reading scientific journals, maintaining detailed weather records, and managing his property with the same meticulous attention to detail he'd shown throughout his life. The idea that he'd been mentally incompetent was not just wrong, it was insulting. David wants to meet with both of us tomorrow morning, Tom continued. He's bringing his own attorney, and he's prepared to file a formal challenge to the will if necessary. He's also indicated that he believes your grandfather's agricultural research was conducted without proper permits, and that any patents or intellectual property developed on the farm should be considered part of the overall estate, rather than separate business assets. I sat in that conference room as the late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, trying to understand how my life had changed so dramatically in the space of an hour. 3 weeks ago, I'd been a struggling elementary school teacher whose biggest worry was whether I could afford to fix my car before winter. Now, I was apparently the owner of agricultural technology worth millions of dollars, and my own uncle was preparing to challenge my inheritance in court. The woman who'd been grading math worksheets that morning had no idea she was about to become the center of a legal battle that would test everything she thought she knew about family, loyalty, and the price of success. But as I sat there listening to Tom explain the complexities of patent law and estate challenges, I realized that Grandpa Frank had left me more than just property and research. He'd left me a mystery that I was only beginning to understand. When I finally left Tom's office that evening, the streets of Cedar Falls looked exactly the same as they had that morning. The same small shops, the same quiet sidewalks, the same ordinary Iowa town where nothing exciting ever seemed to happen. But everything had changed for me. I was no longer just Sarah Mitchell, the elementary school teacher who could barely afford her rent. I was Sarah Mitchell, heir to agricultural technology that could change the world, and apparently, heir to a family conflict that was just beginning. As I drove my battered Honda Civic back to my studio apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that Grandpa Frank had known exactly what he was doing when he kept his research secret from the family. The question was whether I was strong enough to protect what he'd built, or whether Uncle David's lawyers would find a way to take it all away from the granddaughter who'd never even known it existed. The battle for Grandpa Frank's legacy was about to begin, and I was the only one standing between his life's work and the people who wanted to profit from it. The problem was, I had no idea what I was really fighting for, or what other secrets were still buried in the soil of the farm I'd just inherited. The drive to Willowbrook County the next morning took me through 30 miles of rolling farmland that looked deceptively peaceful in the early September sunshine. Corn stalks stood ready for harvest, their golden tassels catching the light as I passed field after field of what appeared to be ordinary Iowa agriculture. But now I knew better. Somewhere in this landscape of traditional farming lay research that could transform how the world grew food, and I was driving toward a confrontation that would determine whether I'd be allowed to protect it. My Honda Civic felt inadequate as I pulled into the gravel driveway of Rodriguez and Associates at exactly 9 o'clock. Uncle David's BMW X7 was already parked in the lot, its black paint gleaming like expensive armor. Beside it sat a silver Mercedes with Illinois plates that probably belonged to whatever high-powered attorney he'd brought from Chicago or Des Moines to challenge Grandpa Frank's will. I'd spent most of the night researching agricultural patents and estate law on my laptop, trying to understand the legal battlefield I was about to enter. The more I learned, the more I realized how far out of my depth I was. Intellectual property disputes could drag on for years, costing hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. Even if I eventually won, the process could bankrupt me long before any resolution was reached. Tom Rodriguez met me in. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In the lobby with the grim expression of someone preparing for war. He introduced me to Dr. Margaret Foster, an agricultural law specialist he brought in as backup counsel. Dr. Foster was a small woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of sharp intelligence that made me feel both relieved and intimidated. She'd driven down from Iowa State University specifically for this meeting, and Tom had explained that her expertise in agricultural intellectual property law was exactly what we needed. The conference room felt smaller, with 6 people crowded around the mahogany table. Uncle David had brought 2 attorneys, Marcus Webb, a thin man with cold eyes who specialized in estate challenges, and Dr. Jennifer Liu, a corporate lawyer whose firm apparently represented several major agricultural companies. They'd arranged themselves across from us like a hostile negotiation team, with Uncle David at the center wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. "Good morning, Sarah," Uncle David said with the false warmth of someone pretending this was a friendly family discussion. "I hope you understand that I'm only here because I'm concerned about Dad's legacy. This whole situation with these so-called agricultural patents seems very suspicious to me. I think Dad was taken advantage of in his final years, and I want to make sure his real wishes are honored." The real wishes comment hit me like a slap. Grandpa Frank had been meticulous about everything in his life, from the way he organized his tool shed to the detailed weather records he'd kept for decades. The idea that he'd been confused or manipulated was not just wrong, it was insulting to his memory. Marcus Webb opened a thick folder and began pulling out documents. Mrs. Mitchell, my client has serious concerns about the validity of certain aspects of your grandfather's estate planning. We've discovered that Franklin Mitchell was involved in business activities that were never properly disclosed to family members, and we believe these activities may have been conducted without appropriate legal oversight. Dr. Foster leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. Mr. Webb, could you be more specific about which business activities you're questioning? According to our review of the documents, Mitchell Agricultural Research was properly incorporated, maintained appropriate permits, and conducted all research activities in full compliance with Iowa agricultural regulations. Webb smiled coldly. Dr. Foster, we're not questioning the paperwork. We're questioning whether an elderly farmer with no advanced scientific training was actually conducting legitimate research, or whether he was being used as a front for corporate interests that wanted to avoid proper regulatory scrutiny. The accusation hung in the air like poison. Uncle David was essentially claiming that Grandpa Frank had been either incompetent or criminal, that his life's work was either fraudulent or the result of manipulation by unnamed corporate conspirators. I felt my hands clench under the table as I struggled to control my anger. Tom Rodriguez spread out several documents of his own. Mr. Webb, I think you'll find that Franklin Mitchell was far more qualified than you're suggesting. He held a master's degree in agricultural science from Iowa State University, completed in 1968. He worked for the USDA Soil Conservation Service for 15 years before purchasing his farm. His research credentials were impeccable. I stared at Tom in surprise. I'd known that Grandpa Frank was knowledgeable about farming, but I'd never known about his advanced degree or his work with the federal government. Apparently, there were many things about my grandfather's background that the family had never discussed. Dr. Liu spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to corporate boardrooms. The real issue here isn't Mr. Mitchell's qualifications. The issue is that valuable intellectual property was developed using resources that should be considered part of the family estate. The farm itself, the equipment, the facilities where research was conducted, all of that was purchased with family money over the course of Franklin Mitchell's lifetime. She pulled out a legal brief that looked professionally prepared. Our analysis suggests that any patents or research developed on the Mitchell property should be considered joint family assets, not the exclusive property of a separate business entity. Sarah Mitchell may have inherited the farm, but she shouldn't be allowed to claim sole ownership of intellectual property that was developed using decades of family investment. The legal arguments were becoming increasingly complex, but the basic strategy was clear. Uncle David couldn't challenge the will directly, so he was trying to argue that Grandpa Frank's research belonged to the entire family rather than to the specific business entity he'd created. If he succeeded, he could claim a share of any profits from the agricultural patents. Dr. Foster pulled out her own stack of papers. Dr. Liu, I think you'll find that Mitchell Agricultural Research was entirely self-funded through grants and research contracts that Franklin Mitchell secured independently. The farm may have been purchased with family money, but the research facilities were built and equipped using external funding sources. She opened a financial document that showed a complex web of research grants, university partnerships, and corporate consulting contracts. Franklin Mitchell received funding from the National Science Foundation, the Iowa Department of Agriculture, and 3 separate research universities. The specialized greenhouse facilities and laboratory equipment were purchased through these grants, not through farm income or family resources. Uncle David's confident expression was beginning to show cracks. It was clear that he hadn't expected Grandpa Frank's research to be so professionally documented and legally protected. The simple farmer he'd been trying to portray as confused or manipulated was starting to look more like a sophisticated scientist who'd carefully planned every aspect of his work. Marcus Webb tried a different approach. Even if the research was properly funded and documented, we still have concerns about Franklin Mitchell's mental state during his final years. We have witnesses who can testify that he was becoming increasingly isolated and paranoid, making decisions that seemed irrational to family members. The witness's comment sent a chill through me. Uncle David was apparently prepared to parade family members and neighbors into court to testify that Grandpa Frank had been losing his mental faculties. It was the kind of character assassination that could destroy someone's reputation, even if the legal challenge ultimately failed. Tom looked at me questioningly, and I nodded slightly. We'd discussed this possibility, and I was prepared to fight back with my own evidence of Grandpa Frank's mental sharpness right up until his death. Mr. Webb, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I visited my grandfather every few weeks during his final year. He was reading scientific journals, maintaining detailed records, and carrying on complex conversations about agricultural research. If you have witnesses who claim he was confused or paranoid, I'd like to know who they are and what specific incidents they're referring to. Uncle David shifted uncomfortably. Sarah, you have to understand that Dad didn't always show his confusion to people outside the immediate family. There were incidents, phone calls where he seemed disoriented, times when he couldn't remember conversations we'd had just days earlier. I stared at my uncle, trying to determine whether he actually believed what he was saying or whether he was simply willing to lie about his father's mental state to get a share of the inheritance. Either possibility was deeply disturbing. Dr. Foster opened another folder. I think we should address the timeline here. Mr. Mitchell updated his will in April 2021, nearly 2 years before his death. At that time, he also executed new corporate documents for Mitchell Agricultural Research and filed preliminary patent applications for 3 separate seed varieties. This doesn't suggest someone suffering from dementia or confusion. She spread out a series of documents showing patent applications, corporate filings, and legal agreements that demonstrated complex long-term planning. The patents themselves were highly technical, involving genetic markers and plant breeding techniques that required sophisticated scientific knowledge to develop. Furthermore, Dr. Foster continued, we have correspondence between Franklin Mitchell and researchers at Iowa State University from just 6 months before his death. The letters discuss ongoing research projects and future collaboration opportunities. The university's scientists involved have confirmed that Mr. Mitchell was intellectually sharp and scientifically competent throughout their relationship. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, with both sides presenting evidence and legal arguments that grew increasingly technical and bitter. Uncle David's attorneys tried every angle they could find, from questioning Grandpa Frank's mental competence to challenging the validity of his research partnerships, to suggesting that the family farm should be considered a joint business venture rather than individual property. But with each attack, Tom Rodriguez and Dr. Foster had documentary evidence that supported Grandpa Frank's position. It became clear that my grandfather had not only been conducting legitimate scientific research, but had also been careful to protect that research through proper legal channels. He'd anticipated exactly this kind of challenge and had prepared accordingly. By the time the meeting ended, Uncle David's confident demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled frustration. His attorneys had managed to raise questions and create complications, but they hadn't found any fatal flaws in Grandpa Frank's planning. The estate would stand as written, and I would inherit both the farm and the agricultural research company. As we gathered our papers and prepared to leave, Marcus Webb made one final threat. Mrs. Mitchell, I want you to understand that this matter is far from over. We'll be filing formal challenges to your grandfather's estate, and we'll be requesting a complete audit of all financial transactions related to Mitchell Agricultural Research. This could take years to resolve, and the legal costs alone could exceed any potential inheritance. I looked across the table at Uncle David, seeing clearly for the first time the man who was willing to destroy his own father's reputation and his niece's financial future for a chance at millions of dollars he'd never helped earn. The uncle who'd seemed distant but harmless at family gatherings had revealed himself as someone capable of ruthless calculation. You do what you think is right, Uncle David, I said quietly, but I'm not going to let you tear down everything Grandpa Frank built just because you think you deserve a share of something you never helped create. The drive back to Cedar Falls felt different than the trip that morning. I was no longer just a teacher who'd inherited a farm. I was someone defending a legacy, protecting research that could potentially feed millions of people in an era of climate change and water scarcity. The stakes were larger than personal inheritance, larger than family conflict, larger than anything I'd ever been responsible for. But I was also someone facing a legal battle that could drain every resource I had and last for years. Uncle David had made it clear that he was prepared to fight as long and as dirty as necessary to get what he wanted. The question was whether I had the strength and resources to fight back, or whether I'd eventually be forced to settle for a fraction of what Grandpa Frank had intended me to inherit. As I pulled into the parking lot behind my apartment building, I realized that the real battle was just beginning. The conference room confrontation had been just the opening shot. in what promised to be a long and brutal war over the future of agricultural research that could change the world. Part 3. The reluctant journey begins. The phone call that changed everything came at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning while I was getting ready for school. Emma Chen's voice was breathless with excitement as she delivered news that would force me to make the biggest decision of my life. "Sarah, you need to get out to your grandfather's farm immediately," Emma said without preamble. "I just got off the phone with my cousin Jennifer, who works at the county planning office. There's a surveyor team out there right now, and they're not just measuring property lines." I sat down heavily on my couch, still wearing one shoe and holding my coffee mug. Emma had been my best friend since college, and her job as a nurse at Cedar Falls Regional Hospital had given her connections throughout the county. When she called with urgent news, it was usually worth taking seriously. "What kind of surveying are they doing?" I asked, though I was already calculating whether I could call in sick to Maplewood Elementary and drive out to Willowbrook County before Uncle David's legal team did something irreversible. "Jennifer says they're doing soil composition analysis and environmental impact studies. That's not normal property surveying, Sarah. That's the kind of work you do before you apply for development permits or industrial construction licenses." The implication hit me like cold water. Uncle David wasn't just challenging my inheritance through legal channels. He was apparently moving forward with plans to develop the property as if he'd already won the right to control it. The thought of bulldozers clearing the fields where Grandpa Frank had spent 20 years developing drought-resistant crops made my stomach turn. I called in sick to school, grabbed my keys, and drove toward Willowbrook County faster than my Honda Civic had probably ever been driven. The 30-mile trip felt endless, as I imagined survey teams trampling through research plots and environmental assessors treating Grandpa Frank's life work like just another piece of real estate to be measured and categorized. The Mitchell family farm looked different as I turned into the long gravel driveway. There were 3 trucks parked near the main barn, and I could see people in hard hats walking through the fields with equipment I didn't recognize. A white van with Meridian Environmental Services painted on the side was parked next to the old farmhouse, and men in khaki uniforms were setting up what looked like soil testing equipment near the edge of the cornfield. I parked behind the house and walked toward the nearest surveyor, a middle-aged man who was making notes on a clipboard while his partner operated some kind of electronic measuring device. When he saw me approaching, he looked up with the polite but wary expression of someone who wasn't sure if I was authorized to be there. "Excuse me," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I'm Sarah Mitchell. This is my property. Can you tell me what kind of work you're doing here?" The surveyor consulted his clipboard. "We're conducting environmental and development assessments for Mitchell Development Corporation. We have authorization to perform soil composition analysis, groundwater testing, and preliminary environmental impact evaluation." He showed me a work order that had Uncle David's signature and the official letterhead of his real estate company. According to the document, the surveys were being conducted in preparation for a mixed-use development project that would include residential housing, commercial space, and light industrial facilities. I stared at the work order, feeling anger build in my chest. Uncle David was treating the farm as if he already owned it, commissioning expensive environmental studies and development plans, while his lawyers were still challenging my legal right to inherit the property. It was arrogant and presumptuous, but it was also strategically smart. If he eventually won control of the farm, he'd already have all the preliminary work completed for a major development project. "I need to see exactly what areas you're surveying," I said firmly, "and I want copies of all the reports and findings." The surveyor looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, I'm just following the work orders I was given. You'd need to contact Mitchell Development Corporation about getting copies of our reports." I walked through the property for the next 2 hours, watching the survey team take soil samples, measure drainage patterns, and document every building and structure on the farm. They were thorough and professional, but they were treating the land like a commodity to be developed, rather than a working farm, with ongoing research projects. Near the back of the property, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The survey team had sectioned off the area where Grandpa Frank's greenhouses were located, marking it with orange flags as a potential site for light industrial development. They apparently had no idea that the modest-looking structures contained sophisticated plant breeding facilities and research equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. I called Tom Rodriguez from my car, explaining what I'd found and asking whether Uncle David had any legal right to commission development studies on property he didn't own. Tom's response was not encouraging. "Sarah, David is claiming that the environmental studies are necessary to determine the true value of the estate for probate purposes. His attorneys are arguing that without proper assessment of development potential, the court can't make informed decisions about inheritance disputes." It was a clever legal strategy. Uncle David was using the probate process to justify expensive studies that would serve his own business interests, regardless of how the inheritance challenge was ultimately resolved. If he won control of the farm, he'd already have the development permits. If I retained ownership, I'd be left with property that had been surveyed and flagged for industrial development, potentially complicating any efforts to continue agricultural research. Tom continued with news that was even worse. "There's something else you need to know. David's attorneys have filed a motion requesting immediate court supervision of the estate pending resolution of their challenges. They're asking for a court-appointed administrator to manage all estate assets until the legal disputes are settled. A court-appointed administrator would mean that I'd lose control of the farm while the legal battle continued. Someone appointed by the court would make all decisions about the property, potentially including whether to allow continued agricultural research or to proceed with development plans." It was a devastating escalation of Uncle David's strategy. "How long could a court administrator be in place?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. "Could be months, could be years," Tom replied grimly. "Estate disputes involving valuable intellectual property can drag on indefinitely, especially if both sides keep filing new motions and appeals." I hung up the phone and sat in my car, watching the survey team continue their methodical documentation of everything Grandpa Frank had built. The modest farmhouse where I'd spent summer afternoons learning about soil composition and plant genetics was being measured for potential demolition. The fields where my grandfather had tested drought-resistant crops were being evaluated for their suitability as housing developments or shopping centers. The woman who'd driven out to the farm that morning to protect her inheritance was discovering that ownership might not be enough. Even if I eventually won the legal battle, Uncle David's development studies could permanently change how the property was classified by the County Planning Commission. Agricultural land that had been rezoned for mixed-use development would be subject to higher taxes, development pressure, and regulatory oversight that could make continued research impossible. I needed help, but I wasn't sure where to find it. My savings account contained less than $3,000, barely enough to cover basic living expenses for a couple of months. Uncle David had a successful real estate company and apparently unlimited resources for legal fees and development studies. I was an elementary school teacher facing off against a corporate development machine that was already treating my inheritance as inevitable profit. But as I sat there watching strangers catalog and evaluate everything my grandfather had created, I realized that this wasn't just about money or family conflict. This was about preserving research that could help address food security and climate change challenges that affected millions of people. Grandpa Frank hadn't spent 20 years developing drought-resistant crops so his son could build strip malls on the testing grounds. I made a decision that would define everything that followed. Instead of driving back to Cedar Falls to worry about legal strategies I couldn't afford, I parked my car and walked to the old farmhouse. I had keys to the property, and regardless of what Uncle David's lawyers claimed, I was still the legal heir until a court ruled otherwise. The farmhouse felt different as I unlocked the front door and stepped into the living room where Grandpa Frank had spent his final years. The furniture was exactly as he'd left it, simple and functional, arranged around the stone fireplace where he'd burned corn cobs for heat during cold Iowa winters. But now I was looking at everything with new eyes, searching for clues about the agricultural research I'd never known existed. In the kitchen, I found the first evidence of Grandpa Frank's scientific work. The refrigerator was covered with agricultural research calendars, planting schedules, and weather tracking charts that went back several years. The level of detail was extraordinary. Soil temperatures recorded daily, precipitation measurements down to hundredths of inches, growing degree day calculations that would be useful for optimizing crop development. A small desk in the corner of the kitchen contained notebooks filled with handwritten observations about plant growth rates, seed germination percentages, and experimental results that read like professional scientific journals. Grandpa Frank had apparently been conducting formal research trials with the same rigor as university agricultural programs. I spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the farmhouse, discovering evidence of scientific work in every room. The basement contained a small laboratory with microscopes, soil testing equipment, and seed storage facilities that maintained precise temperature and humidity controls. It wasn't sophisticated by university standards, but it was far more advanced than anything I would have expected to find in a rural farmhouse. But the real discoveries came when I walked out to the greenhouse complex behind the main barn. What I'd always assumed were simple vegetable gardens were actually sophisticated research plots with different varieties of corn, soybeans, and wheat growing under carefully controlled conditions. Each section was labeled with codes that referenced specific genetic varieties and experimental parameters. The greenhouse structures themselves were more complex than they appeared from the outside. Inside, I found growing chambers with automated irrigation systems, computerized climate controls, and seed storage facilities that looked like they belonged in a commercial agricultural laboratory. This wasn't hobby gardening. This was serious scientific research conducted with professional-grade equipment and methodology. As the afternoon sun slanted through the greenhouse windows, illuminating rows of experimental crops that could potentially change how the world approached agriculture, I understood for the first time what I was really fighting to protect. Grandpa Frank hadn't just left me a farm. He'd left me responsibility for research that could help address some of the most critical challenges facing global food production. The stakes were larger than personal inheritance or family conflict. They were about preserving scientific work that could matter to millions of people facing drought, climate change, and food insecurity. The question was whether a small-town elementary school teacher had the knowledge, resources, and determination to protect agricultural research from corporate interests that saw it only as another profit opportunity. Standing in that greenhouse, surrounded by evidence of my grandfather's life work, I realized that I wasn't just reluctantly accepting an inheritance anymore. I was choosing to fight for something that mattered far beyond my own financial future. The battle lines had been drawn, and I was finally ready to start fighting back. Part 4. The Major Revelation. The hidden laboratory that would change everything was discovered by accident on a Thursday afternoon when I was trying to understand why Uncle David's survey team had been so interested in the greenhouse complex. I'd been measuring the dimensions of each structure, trying to reconcile the survey reports with what I could see, when I noticed that the eastern greenhouse was nearly 10 feet longer on the inside than it appeared from the outside. The discovery happened when I was following the automated irrigation lines that supplied water to the experimental crop plots. The main line disappeared into what looked like a solid wall at the back of the greenhouse, but when I examined the wall more carefully, I found that one section was actually a cleverly disguised door. The wood paneling matched perfectly, but when I pressed against the right spot, it swung inward to reveal a room that transformed my understanding of everything Grandpa Frank had been doing. The hidden laboratory was unlike anything I would have expected to find on a rural Iowa farm. The space was climate-controlled, with specialized equipment that looked like it belonged in a university research facility. Along the walls were growth chambers maintaining different temperature and humidity conditions, each labeled with complex genetic codes and experimental parameters. Computer monitors displayed real-time data about soil moisture, nutrient levels, and plant development that was being tracked automatically around the clock. But what stopped me in my tracks was the wall of filing cabinets containing research documentation that spanned more than 2 decades. The files were meticulously organized, with detailed records of every experiment Grandpa Frank had conducted since the early 2000s. The scope of the work was breathtaking. Drought-resistant corn varieties that could maintain full productivity with half the normal water requirements, soybean strains that could thrive in soil with high salt content, wheat varieties that could mature 30 days earlier than traditional crops. The genetic modification work was particularly sophisticated. Grandpa Frank had apparently been collaborating with researchers at Iowa State University, the University of Nebraska, and even international agricultural programs in Australia and Israel. The correspondence files contained letters from scientists around the world who were eager to test his seed varieties in their own research projects. One folder contained what appeared to be the crown jewel of Grandpa Frank's research, a drought-resistant corn variety designated as Mitchell's 7, that had been tested successfully in field trials across 3 different states. According to the documentation, Mitchell's 7 could produce normal yields with 60% less water than traditional corn varieties, while also showing increased resistance to common plant diseases and pests. The commercial potential was staggering. A single corn variety that could maintain productivity during drought conditions while requiring fewer pesticides and fertilizers could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars to the right agricultural company. But more than that, it could help address food security challenges in regions affected by climate change and water scarcity. I was still absorbing the implications of what I'd found when my phone rang with a call from Dr. Margaret Foster, the agricultural law specialist who'd been helping Tom Rodriguez with my case. Her voice was urgent in a way that made my stomach tighten with apprehension. "Sarah, we need to talk immediately. I've been reviewing the documents from Sunrise Agricultural Holdings, and there are some developments that change everything about your situation." I asked her to meet me at the farm rather than driving back to Cedar Falls. 20 minutes later, Dr. Foster's silver sedan was pulling into the gravel driveway, followed by Tom Rodriguez's SUV. They'd apparently coordinated their trip to deliver news that required both legal and agricultural expertise. We sat around the kitchen table in the farmhouse while Dr. Foster spread out a stack of documents that looked more complex than anything I'd seen before. The Sunrise Agricultural Holdings offer was just the beginning, she explained. The company had apparently been tracking Franklin Mitchell's research for several years, and they'd been positioning themselves to acquire his intellectual property regardless of how inheritance issues were resolved. According to these corporate filings, Dr. Foster said, pointing to a legal document that was stamped with official seals, Sunrise Agricultural Holdings has already filed preliminary patent applications based on information they obtained about your grandfather's drought-resistant corn varieties. They're claiming that their own research teams developed similar genetic modifications independently. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If Sunrise could prove that they'd developed drought-resistant crops independently, they could potentially invalidate Grandpa Frank's patents and claim ownership of genetic modifications that he'd spent decades perfecting. It was corporate theft disguised as parallel research. Tom Rodriguez opened his own folder with evidence that was even more disturbing. "Sarah, we've discovered that David Mitchell has been in communication with Sunrise Agricultural Holdings for at least 6 months. There are email records showing that he provided them with detailed information about your grandfather's research facilities and experimental crops. Uncle David had been spying on his own father's research and sharing information with corporate interests that wanted to steal it. The betrayal was deeper and more systematic than I'd imagined. He wasn't just trying to claim a share of the inheritance. He was actively working to help outsiders acquire Grandpa Frank's life work." Dr. Foster pulled out another document that made the situation even more urgent. "There's also this. Sunrise Agricultural Holdings has filed a formal complaint with the Iowa Department of Agriculture claiming that Franklin Mitchell was conducting genetic modification research without proper permits and oversight. They're requesting an immediate investigation that could result in seizure of all research materials and experimental crops." The regulatory complaint was particularly insidious because it used environmental protection laws to attack research that was actually environmentally beneficial. By claiming that Grandpa Frank had been conducting unauthorized genetic modification, Sunrise could potentially get state regulators to confiscate everything before the inheritance disputes were resolved. I showed Dr. Foster and Tom the hidden laboratory I'd discovered, explaining the sophisticated equipment and documentation that proved Grandpa Frank's research was far more advanced than anyone had realized. The filing cabinets contained contracts and correspondence that demonstrated extensive collaboration with legitimate research institutions and compliance with all applicable regulations. "This is remarkable," Dr. Foster said as she reviewed the research files. Franklin Mitchell wasn't just conducting authorized research. He was actually ahead of what most university programs were achieving. These genetic modifications could revolutionize agriculture in drought-affected regions. But the admiration in her voice was tempered by professional concern. "Sarah, you need to understand that this discovery makes your situation both better and worse. Better because it proves the extraordinary value of your inheritance. Worse because it means the corporate and legal forces arrayed against you are far more powerful than we initially realized." Tom Rodriguez was studying a file that contained correspondence between Grandpa Frank and researchers in California's Central Valley, where drought conditions had been devastating agricultural productivity for years. According to these letters, Franklin Mitchell's drought-resistant crops had been tested successfully in some of the most water-scarce regions in the country. The results were consistently impressive. Full harvests with minimal irrigation, healthy plants thriving in conditions that would normally devastate traditional crops. The commercial applications are enormous, Tom said, looking up from the correspondence files. But that also means the legal challenges you're facing could become even more aggressive. Corporate agricultural interests don't give up easily when this much money is at stake. Dr. Foster was examining a folder labeled International Collaborations that contained research partnerships I hadn't known existed. Your grandfather was apparently working with agricultural programs in Kenya, India, and Morocco, sharing genetic material and research data with scientists trying to address food security in regions affected by climate change. The international scope of Grandpa Frank's work added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. His research wasn't just valuable to American agricultural companies. It was part of global efforts to develop climate-resilient crops that could help feed populations in regions facing increasing drought and food insecurity. As the afternoon wore on, Dr. Foster and Tom helped me understand the full scope of what I'd inherited. The Mitchell family farm wasn't just property with some associated intellectual property. It was the center of an international research network focused on developing agricultural solutions for climate change challenges. But with that understanding came the sobering realization that I was facing opponents with resources and motivation far beyond what I'd initially imagined. Uncle David's betrayal was bad enough, but corporate agricultural interests with billions of dollars at stake were a different level of threat entirely. "We need to move quickly," Dr. Foster said as we prepared to leave the laboratory. Sunrise Agricultural Holdings is clearly positioning themselves to acquire your grandfather's research through regulatory challenges and patent disputes. If they succeed, decades of scientific work could be lost to corporate interests that are more concerned with profit margins than addressing global food security. The drive back to Cedar Falls that evening felt different than any trip I'd made before. I was no longer just a teacher who'd inherited a farm, or even someone fighting to protect a family legacy. I was apparently the guardian of agricultural research that could help address some of the most critical challenges facing global food production. The hidden laboratory had revealed the true scope of Grandpa Frank's work, but it had also exposed the full magnitude of the forces trying to take it away from me. The battle for my inheritance had become a battle for the future of agricultural research that could affect millions of people around the world. But I was still just Sarah Mitchell, elementary school teacher from Cedar Falls, Iowa. The question that kept me awake that night was whether I had the knowledge, resources, and determination to protect research that could change the world from corporate interests that saw it only as another profit opportunity. The woman who'd stumbled into a hidden laboratory that afternoon had discovered something far more valuable than money. She'd found evidence of scientific work that could help address climate change and food security challenges that would define the next century. The problem was that she wasn't sure she was strong enough to protect it from the people who wanted to steal it. Part 5. The Golden Past. The memories came flooding back as I stood in Grandpa Frank's kitchen, surrounded by evidence of scientific research I'd never known existed. This was the same room where he'd taught me to identify different varieties of corn by examining their kernels, the same table where we'd sorted through seeds, while he explained the delicate art of plant breeding that had been passed down through generations of farmers. I was 8 years old during the summer when Grandpa Frank first showed me how to test soil composition by feeling the texture between my fingers. We'd walked through his fields early in the morning, when the dew was still heavy on the corn stalks and the air smelled like growing things and possibility. He'd kneel down in the rich Iowa soil, scoop up a handful of earth, and let me feel the difference between clay-heavy ground that held moisture and sandy soil that drained quickly. "Sarah," he'd said in his patient voice, the voice that never made me feel stupid for asking questions, "good farming starts with understanding what the land is trying to tell you. Every field has its own personality, its own needs. You can't just plant seeds and hope for the best. You have to listen to the soil, watch the weather, and work with nature instead of fighting against it." Those summer visits had been the highlight of my childhood. While other kids spent their vacations at theme parks or summer camps, I chose to spend weeks at the farm, learning about agriculture from a grandfather who treated farming like both science and art. He'd wake me up before sunrise to check the weather station he maintained behind the barn, recording temperature, humidity, wind direction, and barometric pressure with the dedication of a professional meteorologist. The weather data wasn't just casual record keeping, I realize now. Grandpa Frank had been tracking climate patterns that would inform his research for decades. The notebooks I'd found in the hidden laboratory contained growing degree day calculations that went back to the early 1990s, detailed observations about precipitation patterns, and temperature records that documented the gradual changes in Iowa's climate over time. After breakfast, we'd walk through the fields while Grandpa Frank explained the intricate relationships between soil health, plant genetics, and environmental conditions. He'd show me how to identify nitrogen deficiency by the pale yellow color of corn leaves, how to recognize fungal diseases by the patterns of spots on plant stems, how to predict yield potential by counting kernels per ear during the growing season. But the most magical part of those summer visits was time spent in what I'd thought were just Grandpa Frank's hobby greenhouses. Now I understood that those modest structures had been sophisticated research facilities, where he was conducting experiments that would eventually change agriculture. But to my 8-year-old eyes, they were wonderlands filled with exotic plants and mysterious equipment that seemed to belong in a science fiction movie. Grandpa Frank would let me help with basic tasks, like watering seedlings and recording germination rates in the notebooks he kept for each experimental plot. I'd thought we were just playing farmer, but I was actually participating in research that was tracking genetic modifications and environmental adaptations that would take decades to perfect. "Look at this, Sarah," he'd say, showing me rows of corn seedlings that looked identical to my untrained eye. "These are all different varieties, each one adapted for different growing conditions. This row might thrive in dry weather, while this one might be better for areas with heavy rainfall. The goal is to develop crops that can succeed no matter what Mother Nature throws at them." He'd explained plant breeding in terms that an 8-year-old could understand, comparing genetic traits to family resemblances, and describing hybrid vigor as the strength that comes from combining the best characteristics of different parent plants. But now I realized he'd been sharing genuinely sophisticated scientific concepts, teaching me about agricultural genetics in a way that made complex research seem like natural curiosity about how plants grow. The kitchen table where we'd sorted seeds and discussed plant genetics was also where Grandpa Frank had taught me about the broader implications of agricultural research. The kitchen table where we'd sorted seeds and discussed plant genetics was also where Grandpa Frank had taught me about the broader implications of agricultural research. He'd talk about farmers in Africa who struggled with drought, families in Asia who couldn't grow enough food to feed their children, and communities around the world where crop failures meant the difference between prosperity and starvation. "These aren't just plants, Sarah," he'd say while showing me photographs of failed harvests from around the world. "Every seed variety we develop could potentially help a family somewhere grow enough food to survive. That's why this work matters more than making money or winning awards. It's about making sure people don't go hungry." I'd thought his passion for helping distant farmers was just part of his generous nature, the same quality that made him volunteer at the county food bank and donate surplus vegetables to families struggling with unemployment. But now I understood that his international correspondence and research collaborations were concrete efforts to address global food security challenges through scientific innovation. The memories became more poignant as I remembered the changes that had occurred during my teenage years, when family dynamics shifted and my summer visits to the farm became less frequent. Uncle David had been increasingly critical of what he called Grandpa Frank's obsession with experimental farming, arguing that the old man should focus on maximizing profit from traditional crops rather than wasting time and money on research projects that might never pay off. "Frank, you're 70 years old," Uncle David would say during tense family dinners that I'd witnessed during holiday visits. "You should be thinking about retirement and estate planning, not spending your savings on greenhouse equipment and genetic research. This fantasy about revolutionizing agriculture is going to leave you broke, and the family with nothing to inherit." The arguments between father and son had been painful to witness. particularly because they revealed fundamental disagreements about the purpose of farming and the value of scientific research. Uncle David saw agriculture as a business opportunity, land as a commodity to be developed for maximum profit. Grandpa Frank saw farming as a calling, land as a trust to be managed for future generations. The generational conflict had extended to broader family gatherings, where Uncle David would recruit support from other relatives who shared his concerns about Grandpa Frank's spending on research equipment and experimental crops. Aunt Linda had been particularly vocal in her criticism of what she called her father's irresponsible financial decisions. "Dad's throwing away his retirement money on some crazy scheme to reinvent corn farming," she'd complain to anyone who would listen. "He's got all this expensive equipment in those greenhouses, but he's not selling anything. How is that supposed to help the family?" I'd defended Grandpa Frank during those family conflicts, but I'd been a teenager without the knowledge or authority to effectively counter adult criticism of his research. My protest that his work was important and meaningful had been dismissed as the naive loyalty of a granddaughter who didn't understand practical financial realities. The memory that hurt most was the last big family argument I'd witnessed, during Christmas dinner when I was 17. Uncle David had brought financial documents showing how much money Grandpa Frank had spent on research equipment and greenhouse construction over the previous 5 years. The numbers were substantial, representing a significant portion of the farm's agricultural income. "Frank, this is insane," Uncle David had said, spreading the financial records across the dinner table like evidence in a criminal trial. "You've spent over $200,000 on laboratory equipment and experimental crops in the past 5 years. That money could have been invested in expanding the farming operation, or saved for retirement." Grandpa Frank had responded with quiet dignity, explaining that his research was funded through grants and partnerships with agricultural universities, that the equipment purchases were investments in developing crops that could help address climate change and food security challenges. But his explanations had been met with skepticism and accusations that he was being manipulated by academic researchers who were using him to fund their own career advancement. "You're being used, Dad," Aunt Linda had added with cruel certainty. "These university people don't care about you or the family farm. They're just getting you to pay for research that will make them famous while you end up with nothing to show for it." The accusations had been particularly painful because they'd contained just enough truth to be believable. Academic researchers were collaborating with Grandpa Frank partly because his funding and facilities allowed them to conduct field trials that would advance their own careers. But what the family critics hadn't understood was that the collaboration was mutually beneficial, with university scientists providing expertise and credentials that legitimized Grandpa Frank's research. I'd tried to defend my grandfather during that Christmas dinner, arguing that his research could be valuable and important even if it didn't immediately generate profit. But my teenage protests had been overwhelmed by adult certainty that academic research was impractical and financially irresponsible. The family pressure had eventually taken its toll on Grandpa Frank, though he'd never admitted it directly. During my college years, his letters had become more cautious about describing his research, focusing instead on traditional farming activities and weather observations. I'd assumed he was simply becoming more private about his interests as he aged, but now I realized he'd been protecting his work from family members, who would have tried to stop it if they'd understood its true scope and potential value. The isolation had been particularly evident during my visits home from college, when I'd noticed that Grandpa Frank seemed more guarded about showing me the greenhouse facilities and laboratory equipment. He'd still welcome my help with basic tasks like seed sorting and germination tracking, but he'd stopped explaining the broader research objectives and international collaborations that had once excited him so much. I'd attributed the change to normal aging and the natural evolution of our relationship as I'd become a young adult with my own interests and responsibilities. But looking back, I could see that he'd been carefully protecting research that family members were actively trying to undermine and discredit. The saddest memory was from my graduation from Iowa State University, when Grandpa Frank had attended the ceremony despite health problems that made travel difficult for him. After the official graduation events, we'd walked around the campus agricultural research facilities, looking at the modern laboratories and greenhouse complexes that represented the cutting edge of plant breeding science. "This is impressive work, Sarah," he'd said, while examining experimental plots at the university research farm. "But some of the most important discoveries happen in smaller facilities, where researchers have the freedom to pursue long-term projects without worrying about publication schedules or grant renewal deadlines." I'd thought he was just being supportive of my education and encouraging about career possibilities in agricultural science. But now I understood that he'd been hinting at the sophisticated research he was conducting on his own farm, work that might have been more advanced than what I was seeing at the university level. The opportunity had been there for deeper conversation about his research, for collaboration that could have connected my formal education with his practical experience. But the family criticism had made him cautious about sharing details that might eventually be used against him by relatives who saw his work as financial irresponsibility rather than scientific innovation. The real tragedy was how much knowledge and insight had been lost during those years, when family pressure forced Grandpa Frank to work in isolation. The correspondence files I'd found in the hidden laboratory showed that he'd continued collaborating with international researchers throughout his final decade, but he'd stopped sharing that work with family members who might have learned from it and contributed to it. My own career as an elementary school teacher had been partly inspired by Grandpa Frank's gift for explaining complex concepts in terms that young people could understand. He taught me that good education happened when you met students at their level of understanding and helped them build knowledge step by step, connecting new information to experiences they already understood. But I'd never realized that his patient teaching style had been honed through years of explaining agricultural science to international colleagues who came from different educational backgrounds and research traditions. The grandfather who'd seemed like a simple farmer with a talent for education had actually been a sophisticated scientist who was collaborating with researchers around the world. The memories were overwhelming as I stood in his kitchen, surrounded by evidence of research that could have transformed my understanding of agriculture and science if I'd been mature enough to appreciate it when he was alive. The hidden laboratory and genetic research files represented not just valuable intellectual property, but lost opportunities for learning and collaboration that could never be recovered. But more than personal regret, I felt a crushing sense of responsibility for preserving work that represented decades of careful observation, experimentation, and innovation. Grandpa Frank had spent his final years protecting research from family members who would have destroyed it for short-term financial gain. Now I was the only person standing between his life's work and corporate interests that wanted to steal it for their own profit. The golden past wasn't just about childhood memories of summer visits and seed sorting activities. It was about a relationship with someone who'd been conducting world-changing scientific research, while being criticized and undermined by people who should have been supporting and celebrating his work. The woman who'd inherited his farm had also inherited responsibility for protecting discoveries that could help address global food security challenges that would define the next century. Standing in that kitchen where he'd taught me to see agriculture as both science and art, I understood for the first time what I was really fighting to protect. It wasn't just property or money or family legacy. It was research that represented hope for communities around the world that were struggling with drought, climate change, and food insecurity. The question that would determine everything that followed was whether I had the knowledge, courage, and determination to succeed, where Grandpa Frank had been forced to work in isolation and secrecy. The hidden laboratory contained the tools and documentation needed to continue his research, but protecting it would require standing up to corporate agricultural interests that had far more resources and experience than a small-town elementary school teacher could match. The golden past had ended when family pressure forced Grandpa Frank to hide his most important work from the people who should have been his allies and collaborators. The future would depend on whether his granddaughter could build the alliances and gather the resources needed to protect research that could help address some of the most critical challenges facing global agriculture. The battle lines had been drawn not just between family members fighting over inheritance, but between different visions of what agriculture could become in an era of climate change and growing global population. On one side were corporate interests that saw genetic research as intellectual property to be acquired and controlled for maximum profit. On the other side was a vision of agricultural science as a public good that should be developed and shared to help communities around the world grow enough food to thrive. I was no longer just defending my inheritance from Uncle David's greed, or protecting family property from corporate acquisition. I was fighting for the future of agricultural research that could determine whether millions of people would have enough to eat in a world facing unprecedented environmental challenges. The golden past had prepared me for this moment through years of patient education about soil science, plant genetics, and the broader implications of agricultural research. The question was whether those childhood lessons had been sufficient preparation for a battle that would test everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and the courage required to protect something larger than personal interest. The kitchen where Grandpa Frank had taught me to see farming as a calling rather than just a business had become the war room where I would plan the defense of research that could change the world. The seeds he'd planted in my understanding during those summer visits were finally ready to germinate into action that would determine whether his life's work would survive to help address the challenges he'd spent decades trying to solve. The phone call that ended everything came on a crisp October morning, while I was preparing my classroom for another day of teaching second graders about the life cycle of plants. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was explaining seed germination to 7-year-olds while fighting a legal battle over agricultural research that could transform global food production. Tom Rodriguez's voice carried an urgency I'd never heard before when he called at 7:30, just as I was arranging science materials for the day's lesson on photosynthesis. "Sarah, you need to get to the farm immediately. There's been a development that changes everything about your case." The 30-mile drive to Willowbrook County felt endless as I tried to imagine what could have happened overnight to create such urgency in Tom's voice. The legal battle with Uncle David had been dragging on for months, with each side filing motions and counter-motions that seemed to accomplish nothing except generating more billable hours for the attorneys involved. I'd begun to accept that the dispute might continue for years, slowly draining my resources while corporate interests circled like vultures waiting for their opportunity to acquire Grandpa Frank's research. But as I turned into the farm's gravel driveway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. 3 police cars were parked near the main barn, along with vehicles from the Iowa Department of Agriculture and what appeared to be federal agents in dark suits. Yellow tape had been strung around the greenhouse complex, and men in protective gear were carrying boxes of equipment and files from the hidden laboratory I'd discovered months earlier. Tom Rodriguez met me near the farmhouse with an expression that told me the news was worse than I'd imagined. "Sarah's Sunrise Agricultural Holdings filed a federal complaint alleging that your grandfather was conducting unauthorized genetic modification research. They convinced a federal judge that the research materials posed a potential environmental hazard and needed to be seized immediately for public safety. The seizure was happening with military precision. Agricultural agents were cataloging every piece of equipment, every research file, every experimental seed variety that Grandpa Frank had developed over 2 decades of careful work. The sophisticated laboratory that had represented the culmination of his life's research was being dismantled and packed into evidence boxes that would disappear into bureaucratic storage facilities. Dr. Margaret Foster arrived while I was watching federal agents load the last of the genetic research files into unmarked vans. Her face was grim as she explained the legal strategy that had made the seizure possible. Sunrise Agricultural Holdings claimed they had evidence that Franklin Mitchell was developing genetically modified crops without proper federal permits. They argued that unregulated genetic research posed environmental risks that required immediate government intervention. The accusations were technically accurate but deliberately misleading. Grandpa Frank had been developing drought-resistant crops through traditional plant breeding techniques that didn't require federal permits. But some of his more recent work had involved genetic markers and molecular analysis that could be interpreted as falling under federal biotechnology regulations that hadn't existed when he'd started his research. It was a brilliant legal maneuver that used environmental protection laws to seize research that corporate interests wanted to acquire. By claiming public safety concerns, Sunrise Agricultural Holdings had convinced federal regulators to confiscate intellectual property that they could then purchase at government auction or acquire through regulatory compliance agreements. The most devastating part of the seizure was the loss of the experimental crops themselves. Federal agents were destroying the drought-resistant corn and soybean varieties that had taken years to develop, treating them as potentially contaminated biological materials rather than the breakthrough agricultural innovations they actually represented. Decades of careful plant breeding were being reduced to biohazard waste, that would be incinerated to prevent environmental contamination. I watched helplessly as agents with flamethrowers systematically destroyed the greenhouse plots, where Grandpa Frank had tested genetic variants that could have helped address food security challenges in drought-affected regions around the world. The Mitchell 7 corn variety that had shown such promise in field trials was being eliminated as if it were a dangerous pathogen rather than a potential solution to climate change impacts on agriculture. Dr. Foster tried to explain the legal options for challenging the seizure, but her words felt hollow as I watched the destruction of everything Grandpa Frank had worked to create. We could file appeals and request hearings, but the research materials and experimental crops would be gone forever. Even if we eventually won the legal battle, the most important discoveries would have been destroyed by the regulatory process. The seizure had been coordinated with Uncle David's legal team in a way that suggested months of careful planning. While I'd been focused on defending my inheritance rights, corporate interests had been working with family members to develop a strategy that would allow them to acquire the research regardless of how probate issues were resolved. Marcus Webb, Uncle David's attorney, arrived at the farm while the seizure was still in progress. He had legal documents showing that David Mitchell had been appointed as temporary administrator of the estate, pending resolution of the federal investigation. The court order gave him authority to make decisions about all property and assets, including any research materials that might be recovered from the government seizure. It was a devastating legal maneuver that effectively ended my ability to protect Grandpa Frank's research. Even if the federal seizure was eventually reversed, Uncle David would have legal authority to sell or license any recovered intellectual property to whatever corporate interests offered the highest price. The research that had been developed to help address global food security challenges would become just another commodity to be traded for maximum profit. The woman who had fought for months to protect her inheritance was discovering that ownership meant nothing when corporate interests could use regulatory agencies to seize what they wanted. The legal system that was supposed to protect intellectual property rights had become a tool for corporate acquisition of research that had been developed through decades of independent innovation. But the final blow came when I learned the full scope of Uncle David's betrayal. Dr. Foster had obtained copies of correspondence between David Mitchell and Sunrise Agricultural Holdings that showed he'd been providing them with detailed information about Grandpa Frank's research for more than a year. The federal seizure had been possible because Uncle David had given corporate interests the technical documentation they needed to convince regulators that environmental violations had occurred. The betrayal was deeper than I'd imagined. Uncle David hadn't just been trying to claim a share of the inheritance. He'd been actively working to destroy research that could have helped address some of the most critical challenges facing global agriculture. The son who had criticized his father's work as impractical and financially irresponsible had ultimately collaborated with corporate interests to ensure that the research would never benefit the communities it had been designed to help. As the federal agents finished loading their vehicles and prepared to leave, I realized that I was witnessing the end of everything Grandpa Frank had worked to accomplish. The hidden laboratory was empty, the experimental crops were destroyed, and the research files were disappearing into a bureaucratic system that would probably never allow them to be used for their intended purpose. But standing in the ruins of the greenhouse complex, I discovered something that the federal agents had missed. Hidden behind a false wall in the root cellar beneath the farmhouse was a fireproof safe containing backup copies of the most important research files, seed samples from the most promising genetic varieties, and detailed instructions for continuing the work that had been interrupted by the seizure. The discovery changed everything about my situation. While Uncle David and corporate interests celebrated their apparent victory, I possessed the knowledge and materials needed to continue Grandpa Frank's research. The question was whether I had the courage and resources to rebuild what had been destroyed, or whether I would allow the forces of corporate greed to permanently silence work that could help address global food security challenges. The battle for the Mitchell family farm had ended in defeat, but the war for agricultural research that could change the world was just beginning. The woman who had inherited a simple farm had discovered that she was actually the guardian of scientific innovations that could help millions of people. The hidden safe contained not just backup research materials, but the responsibility to ensure that Grandpa Frank's life work would eventually serve the communities he'd spent decades trying to help. 3 months later, I was standing in a rented laboratory facility in Ames, Iowa, working with researchers from Iowa State University to continue the agricultural research that had been interrupted by the federal seizure. The university had provided secure facilities and legal protection for work that was now being conducted through official academic channels that corporate interests couldn't easily attack. The drought-resistant corn varieties that had been destroyed in the federal seizure were being rebuilt from the genetic material I'd recovered from the hidden safe. The research was progressing more rapidly than before because I now had access to university resources and collaboration with graduate students who brought fresh perspectives to problems that Grandpa Frank had been working on in isolation. Dr. James Wilson, the agricultural scientist who was leading the university research team, had been amazed by the sophistication of Grandpa Frank's work. The genetic analysis and field trial data represented decades of careful observation and experimentation that would have been impressive even by university standards. The backup files contained research insights that were years ahead of what most academic programs were achieving. The most remarkable discovery was that several of Grandpa Frank's drought-resistant varieties were ready for commercial development. The Mitchell 7 corn that had been destroyed in the federal seizure could be recreated from the genetic material in the safe, and preliminary tests suggested it was even more promising than the original research had indicated. But the real victory was the international collaboration that had emerged from the university partnership. Agricultural researchers from Kenya, India, and Morocco were working with the Iowa State team to adapt Grandpa Frank's genetic innovations for their own regional growing conditions. The research that had been hidden on a rural Iowa farm was finally being shared with the global community of scientists who were working to address food security challenges. The legal battle with Uncle David had been resolved through a settlement that gave him control of the farm property but left me with full rights to any intellectual property derived from agricultural research. It was a compromise that reflected the reality that land could be developed for profit, but knowledge belonged to whoever had the vision and determination to use it constructively. Uncle David's development plans for the farm had ultimately failed when soil testing revealed contamination from the chemicals used to destroy the experimental crops during the federal seizure. The property that had been intended for residential development was now classified as a brownfield site that would require expensive environmental cleanup before any construction could begin. The corporate partners who had been eager to acquire the farm for development had withdrawn their offers when they learned about the contamination issues. Sunrise Agricultural Holdings had acquired some of the research materials through the government auction of seized property, but without access to the complete genetic data and experimental protocols, their efforts to commercialize the drought-resistant crops had been unsuccessful. The partial information they'd obtained was insufficient to recreate the sophisticated breeding programs that had taken Grandpa Frank decades to develop. The real satisfaction came from knowing that the research was finally being used for its intended purpose. The drought-resistant crop varieties that had been developed in secret were now being tested in field trials across 3 continents, with results that suggested they could help address food security challenges in regions affected by climate change and water scarcity. The elementary school where I'd continued teaching throughout the legal battle had become a testing ground for educational programs that connected agricultural science with classroom learning. My students were growing drought-resistant plants in school gardens while learning about genetics, environmental science, and global food security challenges that would define their generation. The transformation from struggling teacher to agricultural research coordinator had been gradual but profound. The woman who had inherited a farm without understanding its true value had become someone who could protect and continue scientific work that could help address some of the most critical challenges facing global agriculture. But the most important lesson had been about the difference between ownership and stewardship. Uncle David had seen the farm as property to be converted into maximum profit through development and sales. Corporate interests had seen the research as intellectual property to be acquired and controlled for competitive advantage. But I'd learned that the most valuable inheritance was the responsibility to ensure that Grandpa Frank's work would continue to serve the communities he'd spent his life trying to help. The hidden laboratory had been destroyed, but the knowledge it contained was now being shared with researchers around the world who were working to develop agricultural solutions for climate change challenges. The drought-resistant crops that had been developed in secret were being tested in regions where they could help farmers maintain productivity despite increasingly difficult growing conditions. The woman who had been told she was inheriting a simple farm had discovered that she was actually receiving guardianship of research that could help ensure food security for millions of people. The battle to protect that inheritance had been won not through legal victories or corporate acquisitions, but through the determination to continue work that mattered more than personal profit or family conflict. Standing in the university laboratory where Grandpa Frank's research was finally receiving the recognition and support it deserved, I understood that the real inheritance hadn't been property or money, or even intellectual property rights. It had been the responsibility to ensure that scientific work developed to help address global challenges would eventually serve the communities that needed it most. The Mitchell family farm had been lost to development interests, but the Mitchell Agricultural Research Program was thriving in academic facilities where it could continue to grow and evolve. The drought-resistant crops that could help address food security challenges were being shared with international researchers who would adapt them for their own regional needs. The greatest victory was knowing that Uncle David's attempts to profit from his father's work had ultimately failed, while the research itself was finally being used to help address the global food security challenges that had motivated Grandpa Frank's decades of careful experimentation. The corporate interests that had tried to acquire the research for their own profit had been defeated by the simple strategy of sharing knowledge freely with the international scientific community. The woman who had discovered a hidden laboratory on her inherited farm had become the guardian of agricultural innovations that could help change the world. The battle to protect that inheritance had been won through determination to ensure that scientific knowledge would serve its intended purpose, rather than being exploited for corporate profit. The letter that arrived 3 years later would validate everything I had fought to protect. It came from Dr. Amara Okonkwo at the International Institute for Tropical Agriculture in Nigeria, written on official letterhead that carried the weight of global agricultural research institutions. The envelope had been forwarded through the university, passed from office to office until it reached the small laboratory, where I now spent my days continuing Grandpa Frank's work. Ms. Mitchell, the letter began, I am writing to inform you that the drought-resistant maize varieties developed from your grandfather's genetic research have completed successful field trials in 5 West African countries. The results exceed our most optimistic projections, with yield improvements averaging 300% over traditional varieties during severe drought conditions. 300% yield improvements during severe drought. The numbers were so dramatic they seemed impossible. But Dr. Okonkwo's letter included detailed statistical analysis from field trials conducted across Nigeria, Ghana, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. The Mitchell 7 corn variety that had been nearly lost to corporate greed was now feeding families in some of the most food-insecure regions of the world. The transformation had taken 3 years of careful work, but the results were beyond anything I could have imagined when I'd first discovered the hidden laboratory behind Grandpa Frank's greenhouse. The genetic material I'd rescued from the fireproof safe had been developed into seed varieties that were now being distributed to small-scale farmers across sub-Saharan Africa through international development programs. Dr. Wilson knocked on my laboratory door as I was reading Dr. Okonkwo's letter for the 3rd time, still trying to fully comprehend the implications of what we had accomplished. The quiet academic who had initially been skeptical of research conducted by an elderly farmer was now one of the most enthusiastic advocates for the Mitchell Agricultural Research Program at Iowa State University. Sarah, he said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had become both colleague and friend over the past 3 years. I just received confirmation from the World Food Program that they want to expand distribution of the Mitchell varieties to include East Africa and parts of South Asia. They're calling it the most significant breakthrough in drought-resistant agriculture since the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution comparison was particularly meaningful because it represented the kind of transformative agricultural innovation that could affect millions of lives. The development of high-yield wheat and rice varieties in the 1960s had helped prevent famine in India and Pakistan, demonstrating how plant breeding research could address global food security challenges on a massive scale. But there was something profoundly different about the way Grandpa Frank's research was being implemented. Instead of being controlled by large corporations that charged premium prices for patented seeds, the Mitchell varieties were being distributed freely through nonprofit organizations and government agricultural programs. The genetic innovations that could have generated billions of dollars in corporate profits were instead being shared as a public good with farmers who needed them most. The decision to make the research freely available had been controversial within the university administration, where technology transfer offices normally focused on licensing intellectual property for maximum revenue generation. But Dr. Foster, who had continued as our legal advisor, had helped structure the program in a way that protected the research from corporate acquisition, while ensuring it could be used for humanitarian purposes. The legal framework we developed had become a model for other universities trying to balance intellectual property protection with public benefit obligations. The Mitchell varieties were protected by patents that prevented commercial exploitation, while allowing free distribution to subsistence farmers and nonprofit development organizations. It was a new approach to agricultural intellectual property that prioritized social impact over profit maximization. The phone rang with a call from Emma Chen, who had become my closest confidant throughout the long struggle to protect and develop Grandpa Frank's research. Her nursing background had given her insight into the health implications of food security that added important perspective to discussions about agricultural policy and international development. "Sarah," Emma said with barely contained excitement, "you need to turn on the news. There's a story about the Mitchell corn varieties on the International Report. They're showing farmers in Kenya who are harvesting full crops despite the worst drought in 20 years." I turned on the small television in my laboratory office and watched footage that brought tears to my eyes. Kenyan farmers were walking through fields of healthy corn plants that stood green and tall despite the brown, drought-stricken landscape surrounding them. The contrast was dramatic. Traditional crops had withered and died, while the Mitchell varieties continued to thrive with minimal rainfall. The news report included interviews with farmers who described how the drought-resistant corn had prevented their families from facing starvation during a climate crisis that had devastated much of East Africa. Children who might have suffered from malnutrition were instead attending school regularly because their families had enough food to eat. Communities that had been dependent on international food aid were now producing surplus crops that could be sold to support local economic development. Mary Wanjiku, a small-scale farmer from central Kenya, spoke directly to the camera with the quiet dignity of someone whose life had been fundamentally changed. "Before these seeds, drought meant hunger for my family. My children would miss school because they were too weak from not eating enough. Now we have food even when the rains fail, and my daughter wants to study agriculture at university so she can help other farmers." The human impact of the research was overwhelming. Statistical reports about yield improvements and drought resistance were important, but hearing directly from farmers whose lives had been transformed by Grandpa Frank's work made the significance of our efforts impossible to ignore. The genetic innovations developed in a hidden laboratory on an Iowa farm were now providing food security for families across multiple continents. Dr. Foster called while I was still watching the news coverage, her voice carrying an excitement that reflected years of legal battles finally resulting in meaningful success. "Sarah, I've been contacted by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. They want to discuss expanding the Mitchell program to include rice and wheat varieties that could address drought challenges in South Asia and the Middle East." The expansion possibilities were staggering. If the plant breeding techniques that had produced drought-resistant corn could be applied to other staple crops, the impact on global food security could be transformative. Rice varieties that could thrive with minimal water could help address challenges in regions where population growth was straining traditional irrigation systems. Wheat varieties that could maintain productivity during extended dry periods could help buffer against climate change impacts on food production. But the conversation with the UN also highlighted the ongoing tension between humanitarian applications and commercial interests. Corporate agricultural companies were still trying to acquire rights to the Mitchell research, offering increasingly large sums for licensing agreements that would allow them to commercialize the drought-resistant varieties for profitable markets in developed countries. The pressure to commercialize the research had intensified as the humanitarian success became more widely publicized. Venture capital firms were approaching the university with offers to fund expanded research in exchange for exclusive licensing rights. Agricultural corporations were lobbying for changes to international intellectual property laws that would make it more difficult to distribute patented seeds freely to subsistence farmers. Uncle David had made one final attempt to claim ownership of the research results, filing a lawsuit that argued his development of the farm property entitled him to a share of any profits derived from agricultural innovations. But the lawsuit had been dismissed when the court determined that intellectual property developed through university research partnerships was not subject to family inheritance disputes, particularly when that intellectual property was being used for humanitarian rather than commercial purposes. The legal victory had been satisfying, but it was overshadowed by the more meaningful success of seeing Grandpa Frank's vision finally realized. The man who had spent decades working in isolation to develop crops that could help address global food security challenges would have been amazed to see his research being implemented by international development organizations and transforming agricultural practices across multiple continents. The most profound moment of validation came when I received an invitation to speak at the World Food Security Conference in Rome, representing the Mitchell Agricultural Research Program, alongside scientists from major universities and international organizations. The elementary school teacher who had inherited a farm was now being recognized as a leader in agricultural innovation and humanitarian research. The conference presentation was an opportunity to tell Grandpa Frank's story to an international audience of agricultural scientists, policymakers, and development professionals. I spoke about the hidden laboratory, the corporate attempts to steal the research, and the decision to make the innovations freely available to farmers who needed them most. The response was overwhelming, with delegates from dozens of countries expressing interest in adapting the Mitchell varieties for their own regional growing conditions. But the most meaningful feedback came from representatives of farmer organizations in drought-affected regions, who described how the Mitchell varieties had provided stability and hope to communities that had been struggling with climate change impacts on traditional agriculture. The research that had been nearly destroyed by corporate greed was now serving its intended purpose of helping vulnerable populations maintain food security, despite increasingly challenging environmental conditions. The conference also provided an opportunity to announce the establishment of the Franklin Mitchell Institute for Climate Resilient Agriculture, a new research center at Iowa State University dedicated to developing and freely distributing crop varieties adapted for climate change challenges. The institute would continue Grandpa Frank's work while expanding it to address emerging challenges related to extreme weather, changing precipitation patterns, and rising temperatures. The funding for the institute came from an unexpected source, a coalition of international development organizations and philanthropic foundations that wanted to support agricultural research focused on humanitarian applications rather than commercial profit. The successful implementation of the Mitchell varieties had demonstrated that university-based research could address global challenges more effectively when it was freed from commercial pressures and corporate ownership. Dr. Okonkwo flew in from Nigeria for the Institute's founding ceremony, bringing with her soil samples from farms where the Mitchell corn was thriving and photographs of families whose lives had been changed by access to drought-resistant crops. Her presence at the ceremony represented the international collaboration that had made the research program successful and the ongoing partnerships that would guide future innovations. The ceremony was held on the Iowa State campus, in a new research facility that had been designed to honor Grandpa Frank's memory while providing state-of-the-art capabilities for agricultural research. The building included a reconstruction of his original laboratory, preserved as a reminder of how transformative innovations could emerge from individual dedication and vision, even when institutional support was lacking. Emma Chen spoke at the ceremony about the friendship that had sustained me through the years of legal battles and research development. Her nursing background had given her unique insight into the health implications of food security, and she had become an advocate for agricultural research that prioritized human welfare over commercial profit. The woman who had inherited an unknown legacy had become someone who could protect and expand research that was changing lives around the world, Emma said in her remarks. But more importantly, she had learned that the greatest inheritance is the responsibility to use knowledge and resources to help others thrive. The ceremony concluded with the planting of a memorial garden featuring crops from around the world that had been improved through collaboration with the Mitchell Research Program. Seeds from Kenya, India, Morocco, and Nigeria were planted alongside traditional Iowa corn and soybeans, representing the global community that had emerged from Grandpa Frank's vision of agricultural science as a tool for addressing human needs rather than maximizing corporate profits. As I stood in that memorial garden, surrounded by colleagues from around the world who were working to address food security challenges, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from a struggling elementary school teacher to an international leader in humanitarian agricultural research. The hidden laboratory that had seemed like a family secret had become the foundation for a global network of scientists and farmers working together to address climate change impacts on food production. The battle to protect Grandpa Frank's research had been won not through legal victories or corporate negotiations, but through the decision to share knowledge freely with people who could use it to improve their lives. The drought-resistant crops that corporate interests had tried to steal for profit were now being grown by small-scale farmers who were feeding their families and communities, despite increasingly difficult environmental conditions. The transformation was complete. The woman who had inherited a farm without understanding its value had become the guardian of agricultural innovations that were providing food security for millions of people. The research that had been developed in secret was now being implemented through international partnerships that honored Grandpa Frank's vision of science as a public good rather than a commercial commodity. But perhaps the most important lesson had been about the difference between inheriting property and inheriting responsibility. Uncle David had seen the farm as assets to be liquidated for maximum profit. Corporate interests had seen the research as intellectual property to be acquired and controlled for competitive advantage. But I had learned that the most valuable inheritance was the opportunity to continue work that could help address challenges larger than personal benefit or family wealth. The Mitchell Agricultural Research Program had grown beyond anything Grandpa Frank could have imagined when he was working alone in his hidden laboratory. The drought-resistant varieties were now being cultivated across 4 continents, providing food security for communities that had been vulnerable to climate change impacts on traditional agriculture. The research that had started on a single Iowa farm was now contributing to global efforts to ensure that population growth and environmental challenges wouldn't lead to widespread hunger and malnutrition. Standing in the memorial garden as the sun set over the Iowa State campus, I understood that Grandpa Frank's greatest gift hadn't been the farm or the laboratory or even the genetic innovations he had developed. His greatest gift had been the example of how scientific knowledge could be developed and shared to serve human needs rather than corporate profits. The hidden laboratory had been discovered, but the values that had guided its work would continue to inspire agricultural research for generations to come. The woman who had been told she was inheriting a simple farm had discovered that she was actually receiving stewardship of innovations that could help ensure food security in an era of climate change and growing global population. The responsibility was daunting, but it was also profoundly meaningful. The drought-resistant crops growing in the memorial garden represented hope for communities around the world that were facing unprecedented challenges in growing enough food to thrive. The battle for the Mitchell family inheritance had ended with victory for the vision that agricultural research should serve humanitarian purposes rather than commercial interests. The research that could have generated billions in corporate profits was instead being used to provide food security for vulnerable populations who needed it most. The hidden laboratory had been discovered, but the values that had guided its work would continue to inspire scientists working to address global challenges for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.